Today is International Day for Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. We'll be looking at how it connects to sustainable development. In the studio with us this morning is Femi. Well, he likes to call himself my twin, but I don't know if I still want him to remain my twin. But good to see you this morning, Femi.
Yeah, always my pleasure to be here. It's always good for us to remain as one on a special day like this, where we're talking about multilateralism and the importance of diplomacy.
Okay,
so that should start from us.
All right, but it seems like you want to twin more with Idahosa Osamhanze, who is Director, Research Development, African Development Studies Center, and also the VP of the IL 104.9, and is also an in-house analyst here at the studio. From what I see, it seems like you've had a broad discussion, and there's more alliance with the brother.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about that.
Good morning, sir. Good to see you.
Good morning. My pleasure to be here on the show.
So we're talking International Day for Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. Yes, on a day like this, there are talks for cooperations among countries and peaceful resolution of conflict. But so far, this is not the first day that such an event will be celebrated. How has multilateralism in itself helped cooperation among nations? How has diplomacy helped in conflict resolution or even the avoidance of conflicts?
Well, the concept of multilateralism came into vogue in the study of international relations shortly after the Second World War, when the then Secretary of State, Marshall, made a proposal on how to integrate Europe and build up a European economy that was vibrant and able to recover after the shock of the war. And if you remember that the event that led to both the First and the Second World War was the partition of the world into two blocks, the East and the West, and that partition eventually ended up in that great catastrophe that took a lot of human lives as a result of the irrationality of some certain set of people. But here, it was to encourage that nations come together, people who have common issues, common perception about issues, common problems that they need to solve, come together and organize, maybe for benefit of advantage of scale. All these issues were the drivers for multilateral diplomacy in the international sense. So nations encourage, come together, build alliances, and then solve. If you have a common problem, then you come around it and rally around it. But so far, so good. There are a lot of multilateral institutions in Nigeria, in the globe, WTO is there. We have so many agencies in the United Nations. We have EU, we have ASEAN, we have ECOWAS, we have AU. All these international organizations are examples of multilateral organizations, nations coming together to see how to drive and pursue their common interests. But I think so far so good. Only EU had been a success story of multilateralism globally.
All right, talking about multilateral diplomacy, which is being encouraged on a day like this by the United Nations, what kind of approach should be deployed? It's often like being said globally that it should be the norm. But if you look at what is obtainable in nations, it's different. There are barriers to multilateral diplomacy. But what should be the approach to it, the templates to adopt in ensuring that the world engage in multilateral diplomacy on a day like this?
Well, there's a whole lot of it going on at the moment, and I don't think there's a new method or approach that people need to put in place, is to see what things are of your interest, and you see things that will help your own nation or the citizens of your country, and you're looking at it and say, okay, what role will this nation play? What role will the other nation play? Can we come together to form an alliance and deal with our issue? Those platforms and framework are already there. Take, for example, BRICS. You have BRICS, 5 countries coming together to say, oh, we have common interests and objective to pursue in this area. But to what extent has BRICS succeeded is what we should be looking at. Is also to see the fact that, yes, why the world is advocating for multilateral arrangement on the one hand, you also see some level of hypocrisy on the other hand. Take, for example, recently, after the coup in Niger and Mali, the ECOWAS took an action. And what happened? The Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger pulled out of ECOWAS, and then they are forming a multilateral arrangement. So that's also an example of multilateralism, where you're seeing countries coming together to form an alliance. So what are their interests also trying to protect and say, how do they force their own ideology on people? So there's a limit to which a multilateral arrangement can be encouraged globally. And I think in the realm of economies, where, of course, nations are looking at how do they get more money, how can they leverage, of course, proximities to be able to sell products or goods and services, all those things will be just nice. But you see, if you look at it from the African perspective, you see the ghost of colonialism has not completely left us, especially the bad taste that is left behind by the French government and then, of course, the British government. So you are having an Africa divided between English and the French people. And that language barrier, those are arrangements that were entered into by the colonizer with the colonies in Africa, especially in the French, which of course adopted the policy of assimilation and association, trying to make all Africans true Frenchmen, because Africans were seen as the extension of the France territory. So this will not allow that relation in ECOWAS to even function well, because you have to first of all answer to Paris and to EU more than they will answer to their brothers in the ECOWAS region. So this is a barrier. So you're also having ideological barriers. Some people in their orientation are capitalists, while others are socialists in orientation. And therefore, this ideological difference also impedes this approach to cooperation. So if people are Marxists in their orientation, chances are that they are going to be seeing every capitalist as enemy. And so when you ask all of us to come down to the table, then you will be thinking, what kind of ideology should be pursued or portrayed? Is it going to be the ideology of the people in the English-speaking or French-speaking? So all these things are the constraints you see making multilateralism not to work so well in the global space.
You gave example of the EU multilateral arrangements or agreements. What is particular about them? Why do you feel like that has succeeded more than any other multilateral arrangements in the world?
I think there are two basic reasons for it. Number one was that most of those countries in the EU region fought on the side of the Allies against the Axis powers. So, as friends, the US were desperate to see that their friend recover quickly. So the Marshall Plan did not just offer loan to these countries, they gave them grants, huge grants. And then these countries were encouraged to trade with themselves. And that is what has snowballed into what you have the common currency zone now, the Eurozone. There's no other multilateral arrangement that's enjoying that kind of support, either from America or the Western European countries. That's the difference. Rather, you find that like is said in the work of Jenkins, the Confessions of the Economic Hitman, there are a whole lot of undertone playing that is ongoing to ensure that some of these arrangements don't work. And you can see this movement against BRIC, for example, where a lot of African countries are trying to say, okay, I think BRIC will be good for us. But you are hearing narrative from the West that be careful about China. So these are the issues. So why they encourage it in Europe to grow, but in this other area, there's not so much of support that is given to it, even by the United Nations. So this is the real reason why you're seeing that most of all those multilateral arrangements are really not as effective as you see the European Union is.
It's good you're making reference to the example in the Eurozone. Now let's talk about Africa. You know, how will you assess the level of multilateralism taking place in Africa? You know, and if you look at the continent, what are the barriers to multilateral diplomacy that should have happened between nations in Africa?
Well, like I said, I've mentioned two factors already. Another issue really against African coming together to do work and business together is also the fact of the egos of the leaders and the mutual suspicion that exists between us. In the days of Nkrumah, who was the first champion of a United States of Africa, he pushed to the point to see that the only way African can survive was us pulling all our resources together as one. But people like Julius Nyerere were ready actually to support Nkrumah. But the challenge is, who becomes the president of the United States of Africa? Who becomes the most important state? And all this consideration in terms of echo became a very serious problem to that movement until the mutinies, of course, which of course we cannot also separate from all those Western influences that happen across Africa. And then those ideas to actually get Africa as one failed. And then, of course, after Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah, we have, of course, another very significant force was Muammar Gaddafi, who was also pulling to see how to move Africa together. Because most of the time you see that those from the north of Africa really don't see themselves as Africa. But Muammar Gaddafi was pulling because of the way the West really were dealing with Africa and to see how to build Africa. So he was called power hungry. And of course, we know what happened to Muammar Gaddafi at the end of the day. So these are the intrigues that plays in the global scene to see whether are we going to allow these people, because you know that if your enemy gather together and they are on the same page, of course your downfall will be very close. So this is the real issue. So we cannot take away the influence of the West on the politics of Africa. And that was why in his book, Neo-Colonialism, The Last Phase of Imperialism, Kwame Nkrumah asserted that even though we were handed over political independence to conduct elections or periodic elections, but the real power to govern ourselves were not left in Africa. So it was in the hand of those who had ruled us before. So, and they are now ruling us by process. Little wonder you see that, of course, for us to win election in our country, we need to go to them to get validation. So this is the problem in Africa. And I think until Africa really grows up to overgrown this influence from non-Western, from the Western countries, we may not be able to form a bloc that is solid. You can imagine what African is saying and determining how much we are going to sell uranium, for example, to France. That will just crumble their economy. And so they've been, of course, all the energy that is waged against OPEC, for example. Because that also determines the price of crude. And you can see the politics of OPEC since the 1970s and see how the West plays in here and ensure that we don't have a common voice to speak, because we have common crude oil to sell, and we have to determine what price we need to pay, because they want to have the yam and have the knife at the same time.
Now, in having the yam and the knife at the same time, let's look at the role of the West, which you've given examples of how it interplays with different multilateral institutions or organizations. Now, you also made mention of when an enemy is perceived, and then the other person works to ensure that the arrangement of the perceived enemies doesn't pull them down. The UN also has its charter towards a different course and has sustainable development goals. When these goals, or when the multilateral institutions that come together are working towards goals that seem not to align with the UN goal, would that be a genuine cause for the UN or even the Western powers to perceive them as enemies and work against them? The fact that they say countries can come together, should the reasons countries come together not matter?
Well, I think the reason should matter, and most of the time, from the international point of view, is for peace, economic development, and progress. This is the reason why nations should come together. And of course, at the heart of warfare among states is also economies. Because like, what's his name now? Cole said, war is a diplomacy by another means. So any nation that's at war, they are not at war because they just want to fight. So it's fight over, it's always over resources. Who controls what? And so that's the heart of politics. Who gets what, when, and how? So the United Nations, as it were, is not a democratic institution.
How so?
You see, you have a General Assembly that have about 213 nations who come together. But the real powerhouse of the United Nations is the Security Council that has just 5 members. And they have, each one member can veto whatever thing every other 5 says. And when the real critical issues are going to be taken, it's not taken by the General Assembly, it's taken by the Security Council, which is the most serious and vibrant organ of the United Nations. And they have been calling for the democratization of the Security Council, where every continent is represented at the United Nations. So, at the Security Council, so that when we are going to talk about issues that have to do with security, Africa should be sitting down, Asia should be there, Australia should be there, then of course you have the South American there, and all of us sit around the table and say, this affects us. Who speaks for Africa in the Security Council? Nobody. So our interests are not represented. And this is why you are seeing that in most of the organs of the United Nations, they are skewed. How are you going to explain, for example, what happened during the COVID-19, for example? When the World Health Organization was pushing for a vaccine from the big pharmas and de-emphasized and discouraged the use of even measures that were seen to be very efficacious, especially from Africa and Asia. So this tells you the politics of that body. So it's not for everybody. It is protecting the interests of the big, and therefore allowing the younger ones or the smaller ones to pull together to form a block that will be able to resist this strength of the stronger one is not something that will be tolerated or accepted very easily by this power. But like what we advocate, and I don't think we need to appeal to them to really agree, is for us coming together as Africa, for example, to say there is more we can gain together than acting in isolation.
All right. Talking about Africa coming together, I would like you to dwell more on what should be the role of an important organizations like the African Union look at the continent, you have that of ECOWAS for West Africa. Interestingly, her president is also the chairman. Now, what kind of influence can these organizations bring to the African continent as regards promoting multilateral diplomacy?
I think the big problem here is we need to be more strategic in terms of why we want to come together. Take, for example, Nigeria is a huge population, almost half size of the entire West Africa, ECOWAS. Now, if you have a Nigeria, which is a huge market, and also very developed, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, Ghana, Benin Republic, Togo, are afraid that if you open the door, Nigeria will just take over everything. That's a fear inherent in their heart. But somebody needs to assure them that they need not to be afraid. And what we need to do is to see where will each of these countries have a comparative advantage so that they can be encouraged to focus all energy in growing that sector so that they will have something to sell. Because the whole idea of coming together is economics. So if, for example, Nigeria gives opportunity for these smaller countries to develop some certain products that will access our market, and then we'll access their markets in return, then exchange is happening. So, but that mutual trust, you need to build it. And so we have to be strategic in terms of thinking. So we don't just go together and say we want to use the same currency. But we must be able to say, if we are going to use the same currency to trade, what will Chad be trading? What will Benin be trading? What will Nigeria be trading? So that if each country is given such opportunity to grow, you will see that, and I think that's what happened in Europe. See some people specializing in producing just wine, some just beer, some are producing just milk and cheese. So people have area of advantage, and so they are not afraid to trade together because I have something to sell to you and you have something to sell to me. And that is the only thing that can sustain that relationship. But if we are afraid that my economy will cannibalize yours, coming together will become very difficult. And I think this is the real issue that African leaders need to sit down on the table and work out strategy to see where do we have a comparative advantage, what product can we sell to ourselves, that even when the West say they are not buying from us, and we will not have any reason to be sick, that even when we are going to now face other countries, we can now face them as a common front.
This narrative you're painting out, the point I'm making, isn't it better if African Union or ECOWAS is pushing this narrative?
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. The reason why African Union cannot push this narrative is because of these differences and perception and this view that we are pushing. Take, for example, the only man, for example, in Africa today who is actually championing a cause for an entire African country, I think it's Paul Kagame of Rwanda.
Perhaps with the visa,
now,
policy.
How is it going to be seen in view? And so Paul Kagame is not a Democrat. You know, he has emasculated all political association in Rwanda, probably has conquered Rwanda. Now he wants to extend to Africa. And even his intervention to stop killing in Sudan is already being misinterpreted by people that is because it's protecting some interests in Sudan. So these are the real issue. And he says, oh, the reason why I'm in Sudan is I knew what it cost us, what genocide cost us. And another African country don't need to get into genocide. So these are the things in Africa. And I think also we need some measure of stabilities among governments internally in Africa. The way we play politics in Africa is too dirty, really. And I think that's the issue, where you have a zero-sum game, the winner take all kind of politics in Africa. Also must find a way to stop, so that if power are shared and resources are shared equally, then of course people can begin to have a thinking that this is not just about one man, it's about the entire continent.
Let's look at the increasing polarization globally. How would this impact global peace and even sustainable development?
Well, of course, you can see that the world is currently not at peace. So polarization really is a big problem, it's a challenge. Especially looking at the way politics is played and the brazen way in which people are struggling for control and power. And that, of course, will not help global peace. So this mutual suspicion is reinforcing the instability in the world, whether you look at it from the Middle East or you go to Eastern of Europe, where Ukraine and Russia currently is at war, and you see polarization, for me, which is bringing the world back again to that bipolarism, which was really not good for global politics at the time. And you're seeing nations aligning along NATO line, and people also moving along the Russia line, and that's not healthy for the world. And this is where, for me, really, we need to really have a united nation that is strong enough and is also an unbiased umpire. And the only way to get to that united nation is the democratization of the real critical arm of the UN, which is the Security Council, where every continent has a representative in the Security Council. And when decisions that have to touch world peace is going to be taken, then of course every nation, every continent has the power to be able to veto and say this cannot go on. Because otherwise, if you see the way NATO wants to expand into East of Asia, which of course is really at the heart of the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, then you see a big problem here. So respecting boundaries, respecting old alliances, I think is something that we have to really push as a world agenda. Not one person who is always feeling to be right at all times, even when he's doing what is wrong. Like we say here, look at it. The West all have said, oh, Russia is the aggressor here. But they say, no, I'm not an aggressor. There's an agreement that is existing between us and Ukraine, which is around these borders, that we have opened our borders to ourselves, because realizing that we are coming from the old Soviets. That agreement subsists between us and Ukraine. So why are you now trying to enlist Ukraine into your association? And then you have a free access into us. So every country is concerned about its own security. And I think it was the best to empower Ukraine by NATO to suppress Russia. Shouldn't have been the right approach to that crisis, and that would not have been happening. Now look at what is happening and brewing right now between Israel and Iran. So you can see, and like people says, all the weapons that are being used right now, they're all American origin. And so you're seeing an American that is aligning straight with Israel, with some allies. And so people are also aligning with Iran. So on the other side. So these are the things, this polarization is what you're seeing play out. And it is the fight for supremacy that you see here. And that cannot help global peace. And if the world must know peace, no matter how small sovereignties are, they have to be respected. Take, for example, nobody says Americans should not pursue a gay agenda. And I don't think people's sexual behavior should affect economic relations. Recently, we saw Uganda move out of AGOA. Why? They said because they have an anti-gay law. That's not healthy. That can only create more polarization. So I think the big powers, or the superpowers as they are called, should be also respectful enough of the sovereignty of other nations and give them the privilege and the opportunity to be themselves without really trying to impose a culture that's alien to their belief system. So this is a problem, and this is what is actually driving the world into much conflicts and crisis as we see today.
From what it is right now, there's already distrust. Every country is suspecting the other, like you said. There's mutual suspicion. And the big powers are used to play the big powers, while the small ones still have economic issues that make them rely on the influence, rely on the support of the big powers. Do you see this escalating beyond what it is currently globally? The polarization.
You see, in my elementary philosophy of science, they taught us about Alfred Nobel while he was working on the dynamite. And the church authority in Italy came to him and said, you see, you are giving gunpowder for us to kill ourselves, and this is not healthy. And then, of course, he replied and said to the church, you have been preaching peace for decades, and of course, the world has not known peace. So for him, the best way to reach peace is when we reach what they call the mutual assured destruction, where you have equipment that can kill me, I have the one that can kill you, and all of us have this equipment in our hand, then we can come to a round table and say, well, we don't need to kill each other, let's drop it. So that was the argument he advanced in that meeting with the church. And although it was not, it didn't end well because the dynamite detonated while they were there, and it was only Alfred Nobel that survived. And the church authorities that came, they had to go for it. But you see, that's the way for him that peace can actually be achieved. And that for me is also, may not be a weapon, but it's your economic power. If Africa put together to build an economy that is virile and strong, then of course you can come to the negotiation table and say this is what we want. So if people need you, then they have to respect you. But as long as you are not going to take the sacrifice that's required to build a robust economy, then you will remain subservient to that economy. We can take an example from Singapore. When Lee Kuan Yew started to build Singapore in 1959, he didn't appeal to the West the way we are cap in hand going to the West. He knew what their problem was, and what was their problem? It was corruption. And as a leader, he pledged with his cabinet that they were not going to be tolerant of corruption. And as a sign that they are going to leave their talk, they wore white pants and white shirt, symbolizing purity and righteousness. And for 33 years, Lee Kuan Yew drove the development of Singapore to where it is today. Even when there were a whole lot of blackmail from Western media that he was anti-democratic. But today, the West are in Singapore because they have created an ecosystem where companies from the Western nations are thriving. And this is what Africa need to do. If we stop this cap-head begging and adopt the law of effectuation, use what you have to get what you want, we will not need to be borrowing. We may not need at the beginning to have a 16-lane road. Our fathers used farm routes. And I remember growing up as a child, we called them tap planning. We go there with our hoes and they remove trees and build it and fill it. If that's what our world can carry, we can start from there. And then do little things and do them well. And then you become strong. Then you are able to negotiate. But the way African goes about diplomacy today, always looking for something to borrow, to do something big, to prove a point, is not the way to go for Africa. And I don't think that was how American developed, and I don't think that's how all the civilizations grow. People grow at their pace. You don't jumpstart development that because there are high rises in Singapore, we must build high rises today. If that's not what we need, we have to do what is useful for us, that will be economical and prudent, so that the resource within us is able to do it, and then we can build up our wealth. And then the world can see that we are also significant. And when global discussions are happening, then of course we're also given some pride of place.
All right. Let's look at other issues that United Nations is expected attention to be given to on a day like this, which is the issue of climate change. Now, the essence of multilateral diplomacy is for nations to come together to see how they can resolve global issues, and a critical one is that of climate change. How will you assess the global resolve to solving the problem of climate change, knowing fully well that even the Western powers who are advocating for clean energy are also doing one thing or the other with fossil fuel, coal, and other sources of energy? How sincere are we globally, the approach to climate change?
Well, again, this is another area where, of course, people talk about the hypocrisy of the West. Because they're actually the one that are destroying the climate by all their civilization and the things that they are producing. We don't contribute as much as they do to global climate. So the one that is happening to us is a spillover from what they are doing in their own nations. And that was why when people are asking, when this COP arrangement started in Paris, it was agreed that because they are the greatest producer of carbon, they should be able to compensate the African nation for the things that they are doing to us and other less developed nations of the world. Now the question is, how faithful are they to those arrangements? And then we came back to the UAE last September, and we're thinking, oh, let's now restructure how we are going to borrow money to you to deal with your climate change issue. But that was not the starting point. The starting point was that they were supposed to make some payments to these nations. You see, same reason when late MK Abiola, God bless his soul, was asking for reparation. That for our brothers and sisters you use in your cane factories that grew your industrialization, you paid us nothing. And yet you are accusing us of being corrupt, of being poor. But yet you are the one who actually had done this to us. You need to pay us something in form of reparation. And that argument really didn't see any light of the day. But of course, it was a point that was made significantly by MK Abiola at that time. That reparation was due to Africa because of the effect of slavery on us. Our able-bodied men who would have championed our development were carried away. So weaklings and women were left behind. So they couldn't drive civilization. So those who could work in our farm were taken to their own farm. Now, the same is what we're talking about climate change issues. How will you be talking about climate change and you're asking us, Africa, what are we doing that is actually affecting climate? And you're expecting us to spend more money on climate. We have not built hospitals. We have not built good roads. We have no housing for our people. And all you are telling us is that we have to switch energy so that we can invest more money and avoid the real thing that is affecting us, which is climate issues. So this is a conversation that, again, Africa will need to really wise up in terms of having to sit down at that table and ask, because who are actually those people who are giving us this theorization? We also need our scholars. We also need African intelligentials to sit down and review some of this theory and see how true they are really, and how grand the argument can look like. Because some people also have said that the issues with the ozone is more natural than artificial.
But you're aware that Africa cannot be absolutely innocent when it also comes to this blame game about the climate change.
No. What is our contribution? That's the question. There's a global study on the contributions of each nation. What is Africa contributing to the climate change issue? Virtually almost nothing. So that's the reality. The people who are creating and damaging the climate are them.
But it would take a collaboration of the great polluters and the small polluters to even...
No. It's not about pollution. Take, for example, at a certain point, they said, take away all your freezers because the freezers, after all, were not manufactured here. Were they manufactured here?
But they were bought here.
We bought them. They sold it to us.
So there's a part.
Whether you like it or not. You see, that is you must understand in history. Great Britain, in the heydays of their power, were selling opium to China. And Chinese government said they don't want opium. Great Britain went to war and conquered China and sold opium to them. That's where you are in the global politics. So when you have somebody who is very powerful and that person wants you to get something, there's nothing you really can do. So they sold to us, we don't have option.
Why would Africa not have option? Because even if you look at what is being sold that is contributing to the problems in the climate. Now, Africa created the problem by allowing itself to be seen as a dumping ground. You agree that some of the fridges, some of the items that are shipped down to Africa are even banned in the Western world. Now, looking at that, would you say that Africa is not playing a role in this? Even if it's not a manufacturer, but by trade, has it not played a significant role towards the climate problem?
That is the point that I'm making. We are not the one producing it. They are the one producing it. So all the issues that we talk about climate originates from them. That's the point. So we are recipients. And therefore, we deserve to be compensated.
For the trade?
Yeah, of course. You see, because this is it. It's like you give a knife to a 3-year-old or a gun to a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old to play with as a toy. Will you be blaming that child for triggering? You cannot.
Africa is no longer
Africa cannot be seen as a
even
child.
years after slavery.
See, let's not live in delusions. Let's not live in delusions. Africa is still a baby as we speak. You see, check it out in any discipline and see our own African intelligentsia, our contribution to global knowledge. That's what will determine whether you are a child or you are an adult. How matured are we in terms of contribution to global knowledge? So, when you are ignorant, you don't know, and they give you something, what are you going to do with it? You follow the prescription of the man who is giving it to you. So this is where we are. Now, we are talking about climate change. We are talking about moving away from fossil fuel. Who are doing all this research? Are they Africans?
But you have scholars here in Africa.
This is the issue, and that is what I'm saying. See, a lot of the things about Africa is sponsored from the West. And also Africans wake up to begin to engage their realities. And that's why I'm talking about the law of effectuation. We don't need to be very big. We can start small. Professor Osamhanze was here in the studio talking about the potential, for example, of African medicine. But the big farmers will not allow it to work. And they are saying they are having pharmaceutical companies in Nigeria. Are there really pharmaceutical companies in Nigeria? Or we just have companies who are appendages of the big farmers just assembling their drugs here? So this is what you are seeing, and this is what is playing out in the international scene. Africa must come to terms with its reality and then begin to look with a second eye, whatever that is thrown at us. That's the point I'm making. So, in terms of contributing to knowledge, let's begin to study ourselves first and foremost and put emphasis. Because you see how our curriculum moves. It's moving with the tide as things are changing globally. You are teaching a child today Fortran, Abi, and they have moved to Cobalt, so you are there. Abi, you are always playing the catch-up game. So if they say this is the new theory that is reigning, that's what your universities will be teaching.
All right.
So when are we going to start to become the
pace
setter for them to also follow us in terms of discovery, in terms of writing new models and explanatory theories?
Okay, quickly as a wrap up, in order to be the pace setter, would it mean that Africa has to redefine even some of the SDG goals and measure by its own metrics?
That is what it should happen. And that has happened in China. And we cannot forget that lesson in a hurry. Mao Zedong blocked both land, air, and sea borders for 30 years to reinvent China. So China is not just coming out to play big today. It is a decision that was taken in the 1940s. Now this man says, yes, we know that we are doing something beautiful. We don't mind. But we want to take a break. And in that period of 30 years, the Chinese evolved a new language. All the centrifugal forces were broken by one single language that you can call Chinese today. That they are writing new Chinese, they are speaking new Chinese language. That was a fundamental decision for China to reinvent itself. And now we see it paying off. And I think Africa needs to get to that level. Yeah, we cannot do without really getting into the world, but we must also be very sure that we are not opening our mouth and our stomach to drink poison so that we can die quickly.
Early exchange, shaping policy, advancing development.